Thank you for joining us today at the National Garden Club's webinar series. Our special guest is Aurélie de Rus Jacquet, who is an ethnopharmacologist. She is currently in Quebec City at Laval Université in Canada. Her talk is on harnessing the power of plants to prevent, heal, and cure diseases. She has a very interesting background. When she was 14, she already knew what she wanted to study, and that was how people across the world use plants in their culture to cure illness and heal injuries. She didn't know the name of the career until her father gave her an article about the pioneering ethnopharmacologist Pierre Cabillon, and she never could have imagined she would one day intern at the very same institute. She's fascinated by the connection between people and plants. She's known that for centuries, humans have turned to the plant world to solve some of the most challenging issues, including the spread of illness and the onset of disease. Her current work focuses specifically on finding plant-based cures for Parkinson's disease. She was raised in France. Aurélie pursued her education first at l'École des Jeunes de Pepin in Toulouse. But as she sought out a graduate program, she landed at Purdue University. She also studied in Washington and also the University of Virginia, and is connected to other schools for a variety of projects and white papers. But it allowed her, this particular study, to travel the world interviewing people about their medicinal plants they use in their culture. She would then return to school to study the findings in the lab. When she asked about her career path, she notes that it's a multidisciplinary field requiring training and education in the life sciences, botany, chemistry, anthropology, and laboratory methods. And with that, Aurélie, we look forward to hearing all this extraordinary information about your career and how it's impacting our world.
So yes, I'm really happy to be here and be able to talk to everyone about this work I've been doing on the understanding of how people use plants to treat disorders, and how we in science can use or learn from people from any parts of the world, how they treat diseases, so that we can maybe try and find a way to make this into a formulation or a medicine that can be available to most of us. So I'm going to start, like Sherry said, the science is called ethnopharmacology, and it really is a study of the medicinal plants used by indigenous cultures. Maybe some of you have heard the term ethnobotany, which is very related. Ethnobotany is not focused only on medicinal plants, but also on foods and other uses for plants. But here, pharmacology really means looking at the medicine aspect of the plants. But that's not just all I do. I also do neurobiology, because I study Parkinson's disease and how the brain works. And so I'm also a neurobiologist, exactly to study how the brain works and how these diseases that occur in the brain, such as Parkinson's, affect our connections between the brain and the body and so on. But also something I truly enjoy is science education and public outreach. And so I've been able to talk about botanicals and plants to people from many different backgrounds. And here is a picture in Quebec. We have this soapbox event where, women speakers come out in the park, and we just discuss science with people who will come and listen to us. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the presentation. So ethnopharmacology, that's the science of human interactions with medicinal plants and plant and health. And so I've been very lucky to work with people in Nepal, but also Native Americans in the US. And here is a wonderful person who is a Lembi, in North Carolina, and so she was walking me to the woods and telling me what kind of plants that she used for the treatment of symptoms that are related to Parkinson's disease. So this is the places where I've been so far, and like Sherry said, in my dissertation for my PhD, I went to Nepal, and I'm actually going to use the pointer option here So you can see, so Nepal is this really small country, like hiding behind the dot, but it's a relatively small country that's in between China and India. And the beauty of this place is that it's in between two giants of herbal medicine. The Chinese traditional medicine is well known, as well as the Indian traditional medicine, the Ayurvedic medicine. And so Nepal, being in between, gets influences from both these countries, as well as its own folk medicine. In addition, what you already know from Nepal is that we have the Himalayas, and we have this variation that's huge in terms of the ecology of the country. We have Arctic mountain type of botanicals and plants. We also have mid-mountain range, and we have tropical areas. So within one trip, I was able to travel and meet people living in these different types of environments. And of course, the chemical properties and the nature of the plants that grow in these areas is also different. So it's very rich in terms of the medicine and the type of plants that we can find. And then I went and traveled to Montana, meeting the Blackfeet people, and North Carolina, meeting the Lumbee people. And here, again, the geography is different. We have a more, not Arctic, but more rough type of weather in Montana, and a more warm, almost tropical type of climate in North Carolina. And so again, these were two different parts of the country with two different Native American people with different culture and traditions. And so it was very enriching to work with everyone there. So the first step, so when we do this type of ethnopharmacological survey, there are many steps we have to follow, and it all starts with the people. And so the first step is to connect with people in the villages or in the communities where we're going to travel. And so here I've been very lucky to work with many people. And in here, one of my friends now was telling me about the smudging rituals that the Blackfeet Indians have to purify their mind and their body and be receptive to the healing powers of plants. And so we have a number of items here. So the smudge, and we have the spirit animal of that person. And so, so really connecting with people at the human level. We're scientists, but we are also human. And this is what we want to accomplish, being able to connect with them and learn from them. We are really just very modest here, and they know everything. We're just here to learn from them. And here, wonderful people I met in the Lumbee Nation in North Carolina, and here another person in Nepal. So you can see different types of environments that allow me to learn from many different cultures and people, so that we can then study in the lab how we can use these botanicals. So how different are the traditional medicines in different countries and communities? So here we're going to talk about Nepal, and about 80% of the population will use herbs as a form of medicine. There are in urban centers like Kathmandu and some others, but most of the people live remote in the communities. Some areas I visited, they have about an hour Jeep drive to the nearest hospital. So they really rely on what grows around them. Like I've mentioned before, they have access to the Indian Ayurvedic, but also the Tibetan and the local folk medicine. And what's really interesting is that when we study the different botanicals and how they use them, you realize that there are some uses that really directly come from the Indian or Chinese medicine, but some of them are a mix between the local folk medicine, the Ayurvedic, and the Tibetan. So they learn about these plants and then they use it their own way. So most people have basic knowledge of herbal medicine, but there are healers who are consulted if there are serious disorders. And what's really interesting as well is that there are formal education systems where students will go to school, for example, Ayurvedic medicine school, to learn the traditional herbal medicine. In the Native American nations, it's a little bit different. We could explain it as a more sacred medicine. And again, this changes. Different nations have different culture and different traditions. And so all I'm presenting here is what I've learned, but it's absolutely not a ground truth for all the native nations around North America. But for what I've learned with the Blackfeet people is that they have this really sacred bond with nature. And so there are many rituals that, for example, rituals to transfer the right to use herbs, rituals before a harvest. So there will be the smudge we've talked about before. We'll do tobacco offerings when we go and harvest botanicals that you can see in this picture. We offer tobacco to ask the plant for the healing power and to thank them for what they will do to help the person who needs to take this medicine. And also really fascinating is that there are different ways people learn about the uses of plants. You can learn from your ancestors, but there are also ways to learn from within, and that is the plant can tell you what it is used for. And so there are fasting practices, and there are all kinds of rituals that are practiced so that the healer will learn what type of plant to use to treat a patient. So there are, in addition to or complementary to the herbal medicine, there are sweat lodges and sun dances that are really those spiritual rituals that help the mind helps the body to treat a disease. And so just for the anecdote, because this medicine is so sacred, it's also very difficult to learn and obtain this knowledge to then study in the lab. So it was a very interesting experience working with them. So like I've mentioned, we connect with the people, we perform the interviews. Here you can see Rupa. She's a student who was doing her master's with me at the time, and we're interviewing people in the village in Nepal, asking about the use of herbs. So we perform our interviews. And then we ask all kinds of questions. We ask questions about, because I work with Parkinson's disease, I'm mostly interested in the brain. So I'll ask people about what type of plant will you use when someone comes to you with anxiety or tremor or dementia, loss of memory. And so those are all symptoms related to the brain and to the neurodegenerative disorders. And so we'll ask these questions and people will tell us we use this plant and that plant and how they use it. So most of the time it will be a tea or a decoction where you let like a maceration type of extraction. And depending on the plant, people will use the roots, the leaves, the flowers, the whole plant. It really depends because each part of the plant has different chemicals, and those chemicals will give you your medicinal activity. So it's really important to know what plants, how it is extracted, how it is prepared, and what part of a plant is prepared, and if it's a medicine with just one plant or several plants. Because what happens is we extract those chemicals when we make tea or coffee. We extract chemicals from the leaves or whatever powder you have in your coffee. And so it's really important to know all of these aspects, because sometimes you can combine two, let's say a flower of this and a leaf of that, and then the synergy between the chemicals you extract will increase the power of the potency of the medicine. And then once we have all this information, we can select which plants we want to study. So sometimes I will choose a plant based on what the healer told me. And I think, oh, this plant sounds like it's really interesting. They had a lot of success with this one. And sometimes I will look at the literature and see what other people have studied and realize that, oh, this plant has been really well studied and we know what's in it. And so let's just harvest it and do some more work on it. So here in Montana, we're collecting red clover. You can see here a very interesting plant. We can talk more about it. It's really tiny, but it has a lot of good things in it. And so then we, here another picture in Nepal, collecting the botanicals, the plants, and then we dry them. So once we collect our flowers or our bark, we can dry them. This is a setup I had in Nepal. Working with Native Americans, I had a different type of dryer, not that big, but we have to dry the sample so that they don't spoil. So this is all about the ethnobotany and how we use our knowledge to learn from people and to select which botanicals we want to use. So now this is all applied to a specific disease that I've been working on since I started my PhD, and that is Parkinson's disease. So let's move on now to a little bit of the science of Parkinson's disease, and I will tell you more about what it is and how we're trying to use the botanicals we just discussed to treat it or to find solutions. So most of you might know someone with Parkinson's disease. It's the second most common neurodegenerative disorder after Alzheimer's. So it's relatively common. And it's usually affecting people after age 60. Now, sometimes people who are younger will have the disease as well, but the majority of people will have the first symptoms after 60 years old. So there are motor symptoms. So people will have tremor in the hands. They'll have difficulties writing, for example, rigidity, difficulties to move. But there are also all kinds of non-motor symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, intestinal problems. There are a large variety of symptoms, and each person will experience the disease differently. Some people will have a set of symptoms, and another person will have a different set of symptoms. So it's a very broad and complex disorder that we don't quite understand yet. And as of today, there really are no therapies that can stop or slow disease progression. What we can do is give a drug that will mask some of the symptoms. It will work for a while, but then after some time, there will be side effects and the drug will not work so well. And so what we really need to help people is to find a drug that will really stop the progression of the disease. Now, why do people have Parkinson's? We don't quite know. Most people will have unknown causes of the disease. We call that idiopathic. But we think that there is an interaction between the environment and possibly the genetics as well. So there are some cases that we call familial, where we have the parents who will have Parkinson's and the children will have Parkinson's. And oftentimes that's because of the genetics and some mutations in some genes that give a greater risk to develop the disorder. But it's not because you have one mutation that in a particular gene that you will 100% be sure to have it, the Parkinson's. So it's a risk, genetic risk, but it's not like a sure cause of why people have Parkinson's. So oftentimes we think of it as an interaction between environment and genetics. Lots of research has shown that exposure to pesticides and herbicides increases also the chance to develop the disorder. And actually we use treatment with pesticides and herbicides as a model in the lab to model Parkinson's disease. And so what happens in the brain actually is we have a loss of dopaminergic neurons in a particular region called the substantia nigra. And we'll talk more about this in a few slides. But we have a large brain, and you'll see in the following images that it's really a tiny region of the brain that's mostly affected by the disease. So back to the basics of the human brain. It's divided into several parts, and each area will have a specific role. So we have areas for the smell, for the speech, for the language, and so on. And so it's important for us as neurobiologists to understand how the brain works and which region talks to which region of the brain, so that we can understand why people are having the symptoms that they have. So the human brain is the most complex organ that we have. And I'm not saying that just because I study the brain, but when you think about it, there are 170 billion cells in the brain. And so you can see in this cartoon, in the Milky Way, it's estimated that there are between 100 and 400 billion stars in the Milky Way. So we have way more, if you take the 100 billion, we have a lot more cells in our brain than there are stars in the Milky Way, probably. And what's also interesting when you think about it is that 170 billion cells, that's more than the number of humans who ever lived on Earth. So I think that's pretty amazing. And each one of these cells will talk to the neighboring cell, and they all have different functions. It's very neatly organized, and there are circuits of communication. So then for us to understand why the brain, what goes wrong in the brain, why people have Parkinson's, just imagine how complicated that is. So today we'll focus on two different cell types, the neurons and the astrocytes. This is a schematic view of a neuron. So a neuron is a cell that has here a cell body and has an axon that is really long and will transmit information from one cell to the next through an electric or chemical, well, electric impulse and chemical information here at the end of the axon. Just to give you an idea of what it really looks like, this is a kind of a schematic of the brain. We're going to look at this particular region here. It's a hippocampus, which is the area that's affected in Alzheimer's disease. But scientists have made this incredible technology where we can make rainbows. And so rainbows are absolutely amazing, but each color is a different cell. And so if you see the schematic here, we have here a structure that you can see here, and each color is the cell body. So each color is this thing. And so you can see how this particular region of the brain is very, very organized. And so then you can see the projections here. So not the entire brain looks like this. This is very specific to this brain region. Each region will look different, but just to show you what it can look like in some regions. So those are pretty short neurons. So you can see the cell body and the projection, it will stop right here. It's pretty short. There are some neurons that can be longer, like a meter long or more sometimes. So for example, we have what we call motor neurons. Those motor neurons can go from the spinal cord to the muscle to innervate and send information. And so imagine if you have a motor neuron that is in the spinal cord and that goes down to your foot, the length of this neuron is about 3 feet. It's pretty long. So just imagine the diversity of and the complexity of our brain to make all of this work. And so basically, if you do some math, the axon, so this part of the neuron, is 10,000 times as long as the cell body. So it's pretty interesting. So that's neurons, but we also have astrocytes. And so astrocytes are more bulky. So again, we have a beautiful rainbow, and this, we're not looking at neurons, we're looking at astrocytes, and you can see that they are covering pretty much the entire section that you're looking at here. And each color, well, here, each color will be a different astrocyte, and they are very, very large. Now, these astrocytes are incredibly important. They are there to help the neurons survive and help the neurons have all the nutrients that they need and make sure that they can transmit the information to the next cell so that we can function as an organism. Those astrocytes are also there to help monitor the immune system. They have all very important roles, and so oftentimes, well, back in the day, we used to not really care about astrocytes because we thought the neurons are the most important. But research in the past, I would say 10, 15 years now, is showing how important those cells are. So we talked earlier in one of the earlier slides about which part of the brain is affected in Parkinson's disease. And it's this one, so small. It's called substantia nigra. That's where most of the neurons that produce dopamine reside, and they will project out to other areas of the brain to help control movement, emotions, and so on. And so we are very interested in this area because it's lost about 80% of its neurons when people are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So here is now the question. So we understand the brain, we understand there are different cell types, there are neurons or astrocytes. And really, in my research, I wonder how or if astrocytes could be key players in Parkinson's disease, and if we can find herbal medicines that could act on these astrocytes to then restore the health of our brain. So like we've said earlier, astrocytes, they help neurons, they help them grow, they work with other cell types to contribute to the immune system. They also work with our brain capillaries, where they help separate the blood and the brain, because if we have blood that gets inside the brain, that's really bad. So those astrocytes are there to protect our brain in many different ways. So is it possible that the disease could start with astrocytes, or that it would be in parallel with neurons, that astrocyte would be dysfunctional and that would drive the loss of neurons? So those are questions that I'm asking in the lab. So we talked about dopaminergic neurons, and here's a picture of a neuron that I grow in my lab and that I took a nice picture here to show you. There are 86 billion neurons in the brain. Like we said, they have different specialized functions. We are interested in those that produce dopamine, and because those ones are responsible for the motor function, which is lost in Parkinson's disease. So how do we study the brain, the botanicals in the lab? There are different ways people do that, different technologies, different approaches. The one that I choose is to work on human cells. And there is this fascinating technology called induced pluripotent stem cells. And what we do is that we take a punch biopsy from a donor, healthy or someone with Parkinson's. And then we can take this biopsy, which is basically a bunch of cells, skin cells, that we call fibroblasts. And we tell this fibroblast to become immature again, like a baby form, which we call stem cell. A stem cell is a cell that can become anything: an astrocyte, a neuron, a heart cell, a liver cell, a skin cell. And we have those stem cells, when the babies develop, they start from just a few cells that are stem cells, and they create a human body. Well, here we can take our skin cell and kind of go back in time and make it a stem cell. Now with that cell, we are able to produce astrocytes, neurons, cells that form the blood vessels, anything that we need to then model the brain. The beauty of this approach is that we have cells that come from healthy donors, so people who don't have Parkinson's disease, but also people who have Parkinson's disease. And these people may have different mutations that are risk factors. And so then we can understand what is different between the different cells from the different patients versus a control, a healthy person. And that is really helping us. And there's a lot of research these days on this technology to understand the disease and try to find cures or treatments for the disease. Here, I'm just showing you some really nice pictures of our induced pluripotent stem cells. It's a colony. Each green dot is a cell. So they grow as colony this way. These are what we call progenitors. They are the intermediate form. They will give rise to neurons and astrocytes in time. And these are our astrocytes. So remember, we were asking the question if astrocytes could lose their protective role towards neurons. And I'm going to discuss a publication that came out last year just to re-emphasize and try to convince you that different cell types have different roles and they're all important in Parkinson's. So what we do here, we grow on a dish those cells that we call astrocytes. And we collect, so they secrete things out in the media. They secrete things that will help communicate with other cells. So we grow them and then we collect whatever they secrete. And then very simple, we add this to the neurons. And then we ask the question, are the neurons healthy? And the answer is no. This picture on the left shows you in green the neurons. They are in green, you can see that's a cell body, and that's an extension. This is when they are grown in presence of healthy astrocyte media or healthy astrocyte molecules. If they're grown in presence of Parkinson's astrocyte molecules, you can see it's very clear to the eye that the cells are really not healthy. There are few of them, and they don't form this beautiful network. It's like they are really not able to survive anymore. So now that we have this tool, we can ask new questions such as, can botanicals protect the neurons? So those are things that are ongoing in the lab and that we're trying to find out. So what botanicals could we possibly test? There are so many, but I'm going to narrow down to just a few. This one is Mucuna pruriens, also known as velvet bean. And I've learned about this plant when I was in Nepal because it is used in Indian medicine to treat Parkinson's disease, because incredibly, this bean here produces naturally a compound that is called L-DOPA. L-DOPA is a precursor to dopamine, which means that when you give L-DOPA to someone, the body will transform it into dopamine. If you remember, the area of the brain that is not functioning anymore in patients with Parkinson's disease is the area that produces dopamine. So here in the US, in Europe, Western countries, we use tablets that contain L-DOPA, and we give people this tablet, and that's how we help with the symptoms of the shaking and the tremor. But in some countries, they will use the naturally produced L-DOPA by this bean. So the question now is, well, since we have a complex botanical here, it's not just one molecule, is it possible that some compounds will act in synergy to provide dopamine, but also protect and therefore slow down or maybe stop the loss of the neurons? So those are questions we're asking in the lab. Another one from Nepal is Tinospora sinensis. And this one, I was told by the healers that it's used for tremor and for paralysis. So that's another one that will be interesting to study. This one we know better, it's garlic. Garlic has a lot of uses, infections, heart disease, hypertension, all kinds of disorders, but also there are research suggesting anti-cancer, anti-aging properties. Garlic is at the heart of Mediterranean diet, which is very healthy. There are studies showing that people who eat this diet will have better health, better aging. And so that's another botanical that I've studied in the lab. And we also are really interested in the properties of garlic. So maybe not by now, I've convinced you that astrocytes are a type of cells, and they are promising drug targets for developing drug candidates. And I'm not the only one studying astrocytes. There are people also looking at these cells as an alternative or complement to treating neurons. And really looking at the power of plants is quite a strong approach, in my opinion, to studying drug development, because nature is the most creative chemist. There are molecules in nature that chemists are not capable of replicating or creating in the lab. There is a molecule, I forgot which one, but it took something like 5 or 10 years for chemists to find how to synthesize it. So let's just take advantage of the creativity of nature and learn from it. there are all kinds of molecules that we use every day that are derived from botanicals. Like aspirin, for example, was initially, we've learned from Native Americans that the popular species, they have, the bark has analgesic properties. Taxol is used for anti-cancer medicine. See how complex this molecule is. And we've mentioned L-DOPA, which is a dopamine precursor that is found also in the beans of velvet beans. So a lot of this work is ongoing, and we keep working on it. And so some of it has been published so that other scientists can learn from these findings and continue the work, and also people interested can read the publications. But I've done some work on red clover here and soy. And the reason why I focused on these two in this particular publication is because they contain isoflavones, which are phytoestrogens. And so they have hormone mimicking activities. And so there are interesting results finding that isoflavones and even the raw extract seem to have some beneficial effect in the neurons. This is numbers for Canadian population, but I think it's quite similar for the US. But about 35% of Canadians use dietary supplements, and most of them are people 51 years and older. And so there is a real interest and a real desire for the people to use more natural medicines. And so I think we are at a stage where we're encouraged to continue and provide some new medicines for people. So if you were to summarize this work, we try to understand how people use plants. We try to understand how the brain works, which brain cells are maybe the most interesting to study. And then we try and combine the two findings. So we work with patients so that we can have samples from their skin to do human studies using stem cells that we differentiate into astrocytes and neurons, and we can do very, core science, hard science work in the lab. But we also want to learn from people how they use plants, and if we can translate the findings from plants to drug or plants to healthy diet. It's very, there are broad opportunities here. And so I haven't talked about it, but we've worked on blueberries, we mentioned soy and isoflavones, and then all of that gets combined into the research program where we try and understand how we can use botanicals to help improve the health of our brain. So this is all the fun science, but it's only fun if people can understand it. And so, this publication that we write and that we publish is really for other scientists, because, it's very complicated and we have these terms and these images. And so it's been a mission of mine to try and make it accessible to everyone. And so I've created this Facebook channel, and you can go check it out if you're interested. It's bilingual, so there will be publications in French or in English or both. But what I'm trying to do here is explain the science that we do in the lab in terms that we can all understand. So, for example, I've created this cartoon, and this one is in French. I really need to take time and translate in English, but this is explaining one of the publications that came out last year. We have some, fun science facts. For example, did you know that there are more trees on Earth than stars in the Milky Way? That's pretty cool. And also part of the work is to translate the findings to people in the hospitals. And here is particularly designed for Native Americans. And so I was very fortunate to work with the local Indigenous Health and Commission Center to create posters that we can then send out to community health centers. And then have them displayed, and so that people can learn about Parkinson's and the type of research that is done to try and develop drugs. So all of this work is done in collaboration. We never work by ourselves. There are all kinds of collaborations and people who are involved. So I have my collaborators here and people with whom I've done my training. So Chris Roche at Purdue, and here are my 2 labs for my postdocs. Of course, the participants in the studies, people of Nepal, Blackfeet and Lumbee people. And I'm just now opening my own lab where I will continue this research. So big thanks to those students who joined me in the past few months. And of course, none of this work can be done without the funding. I've been very, very lucky to be supported since the early stages of my career by wonderful foundations. So the Phipps Botanic Garden has a program called Botany in Action, where they give fellowships to support PhD students to the work. And thanks to them, I was able to go out in the field in Nepal and with Native Americans. The Parkinson Foundation, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and the Hospital Foundation, where we have anonymous donors who will just give, donate to increase or promote the research for Parkinson's disease and other disorders. And so people who are interested in supporting this work can go to this website where it's possible to make donations to help us continue the work. So with this, I'd like to thank all of you. I hope this was interesting and clear, but I'm happy to take any questions anytime.